Have a holly jolly Christmas.
The free iHeartRadio app. Load it up with holiday cheer. Listen to iHeart Christmas, playing nonstop holiday music commercial-free. Some might call it a Christmas miracle.
Have a happy holiday.
Open the free iHeartRadio app and search Holiday now.
Play right together with you.
Free never sounded so good. iHeartRadio.
So, Michael, on Monday, Donald Trump continued to fill out his cabinet picks, and one of the most recent announced picks is for Transportation Secretary. It's a former congressman from Wisconsin named Sean Duffy who has something else in his resume that people of a certain age might remember. And I have a feeling that maybe Michael remembers. Michael, do you know what I'm talking about?
I am old enough. Yes, he was on The Real World, wasn't he?
This is the true story.
Whatever of 7 strangers.
You were a fan, weren't you? You watched the show.
I saw a couple seasons. I don't think I was a fan. I think there was a couple years during that, 2 decades that I actually had cable and did watch. Did
you actually watch the seasons that involved Sean Duffy?
I have no memory of that. It's possible. Okay. I can't deny it.
Welcome to the Campaign Moment from the Washington Post, your guide to the biggest developments in the 2024 election and the Trump transition that has followed it. I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter here at the Post and writer of the Campaign Moment newsletter. It is Tuesday, November 19th. And today we have with us national political reporter Michael Shearer. Hey, Michael.
Hey, thanks for having me back.
Thanks for being back. So today we're going to be going in depth on a couple of Donald Trump's most controversial cabinet picks. There's former Congressman Matt Gaetz, who Trump said that he'd like to see as Attorney General. And then there's Fox News host Pete Hegseth, who could head the Department of Defense. Trump has made a number of controversial picks for his cabinet, but these are the ones that we're learning the most about right now. Both of them have been the focus of sexual misconduct allegations, among other inquiries, and both have other problems that could also serve as stumbling blocks when it comes to winning the required amount of support from Senate Republicans. Just as a reminder, there are 53 Republicans in the Senate, so if every Democrat votes against these picks, 4 Republican senators voting against them could kill off their nominations. So today we're going to run through these controversies, how Republicans are responding to them, and whether or not questions of character really matter in a second Trump administration. And just a warning, in this episode, we're going to be talking about those allegations of sexual misconduct. So keep that in mind as you listen. Michael, I wanted to start with the nomination that I think has gotten the most attention, and that is Matt Gaetz for Attorney General. Our colleagues on Post Reports did an episode the day after Trump announced his intention to nominate Gaetz last week. But for us today, I wanted to shift a little bit and dive a little deeper into some key issues. And to set the tone, I wanted to first play some audio from the audiobook version of Gaetz's 2020 memoir titled Firebrand, Dispatches from the Front Lines of the MAGA Revolution, which Gaetz himself reads. This is from the first chapter, which is called Sex and Money.
It's risky to date in a town where there's potentially a thin line between love and blackmail, or at least love and bad PR. But we've got a president now who doesn't care for puritanical grandstanding or moralistic preening. He's a lot more direct, even visceral, open, and realistic about his likes and dislikes. So overall, it's a good time to be a fun-loving politician instead of a stick in the mud. I have an active social life, and it's probably easier in the era of Trump. We've had perfect family man presidents before, and after all, many of those men sold out our country, even as their wives were happy the whole time.
So this was written and recorded before the most serious of the allegations of Gaetz came to life, or at least became public knowledge. Can you just talk a little bit about what it says that somebody with this kind of outlook would be nominated to a cabinet position?
Yeah, I'm glad you started with the book because I've read much of it, and it's not not one of the best political memoirs I've read, but it certainly stands out for the pose he takes as sort of the rock and roll congressman come to Washington. There's another part, I think it's chapter 6, where he begins in the hot tub at Mar-a-Lago with a woman he met 24 hours earlier, and he talks about how great it is to be kissing someone with Secret Service protection. And he talks about how Washington needs more members of Congress like Charlie Wilson, who did cocaine with prostitutes while working on the Cold War. It's just not the sort of thing that you would expect 10 years ago, 15 years ago from a Republican politician, definitely. And as you said, this is sort of the public pose he took before the very serious allegations came out about alleged criminal behavior, for which he has denied any culpability, has said is totally false, but which, one of his very good friends has pled guilty to in Florida, and which the House has investigated. And we now have reporting that there's been testimony given in that investigation from witnesses who said they saw Gaetz do morally repugnant acts, just would never have been a part of a conversation of a confirmation, at any point since I've been in Washington, starting in the early 2000s.
Yeah, and this is, of course, the new reporting here from the Post. A lawyer for two women who have testified to the House Ethics Committee said that Gaetz paid them for sex and that one of them witnessed him having sex with a 17-year-old at a house party. Gaetz, of course, has previously denied these kinds of allegations. They were the subject of a Justice Department investigation where he was ultimately not charged, even though his friend Joel Greenberg was ultimately sentenced to 11 years in prison for this. But this is a story that is clearly evolving, and there is going to be, journalists like you digging into it. We're waiting to find out if we're going to see a House Ethics Committee report. What do you think kind of the key aspects of this here and kind of the key unknowns are in this whole thing?
Let me just do like the 30-second rendition of what this story is. Shortly after Gaetz is elected to Congress, 2017, 2018, he has a friend in the Orlando area named Joel Greenberg who has a local office, a local position. And Joel, based on his own guilty plea in a court case, begins having parties where he's inviting young women, he's paying them for sex, and one of those women, at least, according to him, was underage. And what is not contradicted is that it is true that Matt Gaetz was close friends with him. We know from other reporting at around the same time, Gaetz was showing videos on his phones or pictures on his phone to colleagues with either topless or naked women. He would talk about Joel Greenberg and about the wildness of these parties he was a part of. And now we have testimony that some people present at these parties, in addition to Greenberg, who's pled guilty and said these things under oath, witnessed Gaetz committing these acts.
And just to note here, Greenberg agreed to plead guilty to 6 criminal charges, including sex trafficking of a child, aggravated identity theft, and wire fraud.
And this is all coming in the context of Gaetz being probably the single most disliked elected leader on Capitol Hill, because in addition to his personal behavior, he has cast himself as sort of a wrecking ball for the institutional leadership in which he serves. He led the charge to topple House Speaker Kevin McCarthy and earned the deep disrespect and enmity of a significant number of his colleagues. I think it's worth saying also, there were other allegations that were investigated about a plane trip overseas with some of these women, a possible sex trafficking charge. It is true that the Justice Department did not pursue charges in this matter, did investigate this matter. It's also true that the Justice Department typically does not prosecute, straight prostitution cases without some other equity. I mean, these are usually state cases. The Justice Department does not typically prosecute illegal recreational drug use. So I don't think we can conclude based on the non-prosecution that the Justice Department cleared him of any acts. It just decided against prosecution. And I think it's also clear to say that the dislike and disrespect of Matt Gaetz extends from the House into the Senate. And the Senate, as you've described, you basically need Republicans to hold together with a few exceptions in order for him to get through. It is not at all clear that he even has 30 Republican senators at this point. Mm-hmm. A number of people who would otherwise be his allies, who would otherwise be votes for him, have said publicly that they want to see this report that is prepared, that is done by the House Ethics Committee. Typically in these sort of, nomination fights, you have a hearing. You have the nominee go room to room and meet with all the different senators, introduce themselves and answer questions privately. You have FBI background check to find out if there's anything that is blackmailable. It's not at all clear at this point whether any of that's going to happen or how it's going to proceed. But if it did proceed along sort of the normal historical patterns, Gaetz has a real uphill battle at this point.
I wanted to touch on something that you brought up in the course of that answer, which is Gaetz's relationships with his fellow Republicans, because I think that is so important here. Like the allegations that have been brought against him are important and could undergird whatever opposition to him ultimately arises here. But on some level, politics is about the personal, it's about relationships, it's about whether people are willing to go to bat for you. I think it's more likely that Republicans are willing to go to bat for Matt Gaetz because he is Donald Trump's nominee than because they like Matt Gaetz personally. Some comments that I think really drive this home are from Senator Mark Wayne Mullen of Oklahoma, who used to be in the House and was a colleague of Gaetz's there. And he was talking to CNN last year and made the point that, his colleagues didn't really want to defend Gaetz against the allegations of sexual misconduct for a whole bunch of reasons. Let's listen.
There's a reason why no one in the conference came and defended him, because we had all seen the videos he was showing on the House floor that all of us had walked away of the girls that he had slept with. He'd brag about how he would crush ED medicine and chase it with an energy drink so he could go all night. This is obviously before you got married.
I remember seeing that clip on social media, I guess it's almost a little bit over a year ago, and being like, oh, wow, that's something. Like we knew some of these investigations were taking place and some of the allegations against Gaetz, but then we have one of his colleagues coming out and, saying these things. Just talk a little bit about like how little affection there is for Gaetz in Republican circles and how that could, eventually lead to opposition.
So it's in the book. It's in the chapter you had him read at the top of the show suggests the attitude he came to Washington with, which was, this is a corrupt place. It's a backwards place. The people here are rotten. And that what we need to do is really stir things up and really cause problems. And I'm going to operate by a different set of rules, different set of personal rules, different set of values. And he, from the beginning, would run towards pretty much any cable news camera that would have him. And most of the time he was on TV, he was attacking his colleagues, which is not the typical way to gain power and influence in Washington. It was an outside game. He was basically coming to break the place. And he's been very successful in that, mainly because he's attached himself to President-elect Trump, who is enormously successful at getting votes. One thing that needs to be mentioned here is he is being nominated to be the head of the Department of Justice, the top law enforcement official in the country. This is not Department of Interior or Commerce or Agriculture. This is a cop role, and it oversees the entire Justice Department, which is enormously powerful, has enormous independent jurisdiction typically from the president, operates under its own rules. And I think that has also created a significant amount of alarm. Gaetz is an attorney, but he has never been a prosecutor. He doesn't have experience with the Justice Department directly beyond being investigated himself. And his relationship with the Justice Department publicly has been, we should basically tear it down. I mean, he has called for defunding the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the DOJ during his investigation. I think this is the appeal for President Trump about why he was selected for this role.
Yeah, that's a great point about, what he would do when he's in the Justice Department. That's also something that I've been thinking about. We see these Republicans line up behind the idea that, Trump was persecuted by the Justice Department in his, various criminal cases, the idea that this was the weaponization of government. It took a while for the Republican Party to embrace these ideas, which are corrosive to the rule of law, but they ultimately did get there. Speaking of the shifting politics on this, one of the things we're watching right now is whether we're going to see this House Ethics Committee report on Gaetz that was potentially being released on Friday. That was shelved after he resigned from Congress. The House Ethics Committee no longer has jurisdiction at that point, but they could still release this report. There is a meeting that is taking place Wednesday where they'll be discussing that. I wondered, Michael, what do you think the odds are that we ever know the contents of what's in this ethics report?
I think they're pretty high, and that's because there's several ways for it to come out. I mean, the House Ethics Committee could just vote to release the report. We don't know how widely it's been circulated, but presumably a number of people have already read the report in draft form, so there are other people who have it. And then we have what's been happening the last few days, which is attorneys for witnesses in the report coming out and telling the story publicly, mainly as an effort to keep their clients off a witness stand in front of the Senate. They don't want these women to be brought up later and have to testify in front of the whole country. I mean, one of the distinguishing features of this Gaetz saga is that the people involved in these parties have not gone public. The woman who was underage at the time, or allegedly underage at the time, she has repeatedly refused to comment publicly, which is her right. And I don't think she has much interest in becoming the public face of this story. But they still could be compelled to testify. They could choose to make their stories public. They've already testified in many cases under oath about these same actions. Joel Greenberg has already given statements. I mean, the second part of this is that there was a Justice Department investigation. It didn't lead to charges. We don't know exactly how far that investigation went, but that's a separate process. And the Senate could reach out to the Justice Department and say, look, we're dealing with this nominee. Please give us the work product of that investigation. And so information could come out that way as well.
Yeah, and I think it's worth noting that some of these senators have called for this ethics committee report to be released or at least given to them. And they certainly have an interest in knowing, at least for themselves, what's contained in some of these investigative materials. We're going to take a quick break, but when we come back, we'll be talking about Pete Hegseth, Trump's pick to lead the Defense Department, who's also getting some scrutiny for sexual assault allegations and other personal issues. We'll be right back. So, Michael, continuing on this theme of how personal conduct is becoming a big issue with some of Trump's cabinet picks, I wanted to talk about the other cabinet pick that we're learning about right now, and that is Pete Hegseth. Hegseth is a Fox News host, a weekend host, and a former Army National Guard officer who Trump wants to lead the Department of Defense. And this was maybe Trump's first big surprise pick last week because few people had Hegseth on their radar. He's relatively young for this kind of a job. He doesn't have the same kind of experience most people would have for this job, which involves overseeing millions of people who work under the Pentagon's umbrella. Now our colleagues here at the Washington Post have reported that Hegseth has faced a sexual assault allegation, which he denies. Michael, can you talk a little bit about what Hegseth has been accused of?
Yeah, so this is an incident that the Trump team did not know about when the nomination was put forward, but which they got a letter about, a sort of Jane Doe letter from a friend of the accuser last week, describing an incident in California after a conference at a bar where a woman who was married, the way it was described was, he was drinking with some other women. She was sort of running interference. And then the next thing she knows or is sort of fully aware of, it's the following morning, and she remembers unconsensual sex from the night before with Hegseth. Eventually, the attorney for Hegseth said there was an encounter. It was a consensual sexual encounter. And after the encounter, because this woman who, was traumatized by the event and was making noise about it, Hegseth agreed to a payment to her, a sort of private payment to her in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement. That's why the letter came from a friend, not the woman herself. But the attorney says that payment was only because, not an admission of guilt in any way. It was just the easiest way to make what Hegseth saw as sort of slanderous allegations against him in his public career as a Fox News host go away.
Yeah, didn't they say he was worried about losing his job at Fox if this came to light?
Yes, I think it's fair to say there could be reputational damage if this came to light. So there's no admission of guilt. There is admission of the sexual encounter under unclear circumstance. The other thing is that, there was a report made to local police in California. According to the letter, police investigated, but because of the hazy memory of the accuser, there was never evidence to do a prosecution. And we know that there was no prosecution of the alleged rape. But again, going back to what we said before, I mean, in a typical nomination process before the U.S. Senate, if there is an accusation like this, the Senate has the power to do its own investigation, and the FBI will do a background check. Again, the FBI background check is largely focused on, looking for any reason in any nominee's past that they could be vulnerable to blackmail or have sort of criminal dealings. And so this is one where there hasn't been extensive investigation, but you could very well see one. Or, on the flip side, there could be an unconventional nomination process in which there is no real investigation of Hegseth.
Right. Another big story on Hegseth this week is about his departure from the National Guard, which came after January 6th, 2021. We've learned that a fellow service member raised concerns about Hegseth and possibly having extremist ties. And this has to do with Hegseth's tattoos, which if you look up photos of Hegseth, you can see all of them. Talk a little bit about what the crux of this issue is and why these tattoos are being questioned.
Yeah, and this actually was the subject of a book Hegseth wrote, and I think is more close to the reason that he was chosen by President Trump to lead the Defense Department.
Right, it's called the War on Warriors, right?
The War on Warriors. And so basically, Hegseth was in the reserves after the attacks of January 6th, was assigned to provide security for the inauguration in early 2021. And this is at a time when there was enormous alarm in Washington and within the military about the idea that there were extremist elements inside the military and law enforcement who did not support the peaceful transfer of power. Now, there is no accusation that has been made anywhere that Hegseth himself did not support the peaceful transfer of power or that he had any plans to do anything disruptive or other than his orders at this event. But because he had tattoos, one of them are the Latin words Deus Vult, which means God wills it. It's a motto of the Crusades. And this was allegedly one of the reasons that he was flagged as a possible extremist. One of them is a Jerusalem cross, which can mean various things to various people, but is just a Christian symbol across his chest. That he was suspect and pushed out. And the book he subsequently wrote, and this is, I think, why this is all important, was about the threat from within to U.S. military readiness. And he's actually said very clearly that he thinks the greatest national security threat right now that the U.S. military faces is a cultural threat from within. And it is, he describes it as sort of the woke politics of the last couple decades, which has harmed readiness and weakened our ability to defend ourselves. And he includes in that all kinds of changes that have happened in military policy in recent years to make more positions open to transgender soldiers, to female soldiers. He's been very clear that he's against women in combat roles. He's okay with a woman flying a fighter jet, but not in an infantry battalion. And he believes that there is a huge political correctness that has harmed morale, that has harmed military recruitment, and that really imperils the country. And has basically said, and this is before he was named as a defense secretary nominee, that what needs to happen is any generals that were involved in any of these policies need to be cleaned out. And so he's calling for a real house cleaning at the DOD to sort of return to an earlier period of personnel policy in the military. And I think that's very attractive to the president. It echoes a lot of the president's own rhetoric on the stump, his own concern about woke politics, and his own feeling coming out of the first term that his generals were not always working on his side and were not always following his orders. And we know that now from reporting, that there were a number of instances where his former defense secretary or his former generals would try and find ways to not act immediately on decisions the president made because they thought they would harm the country. Trump does not want to be in that situation again, and is, I think, confident that Hegseth would make sure that would not happen again.
Yeah, I read this book, The War on Warriors, after Hegseth was picked last week, because I think this is a selection that really caught people by surprise. But as I was going through this book, I was like, oh, yeah, this book basically sounds like somebody who is auditioning to be Donald Trump's defense secretary, because his views of military culture and of kind of the corrosive, in his view, actions of our military leadership. The other thing that's important here is usually you look at these nominations and you look at the idea that they could eventually be rejected as some kind of an embarrassment that you want to avoid. And I'm just not sure that Donald Trump cares that much. Like he wants it, but as far as the embarrassment factor, if he doesn't get it, that doesn't seem to be something that probably weighs on Trump too much. He probably looks at this and says, it's worth trying. If it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. But this is the guy that I really want. Does that sound about right to you, or what's your view on that?
Yeah, I would agree. I think the other thing to say is that he doesn't have the same reverence for convention and how these things have been done in the past. He said shortly after the election that he wants the Senate to clear the way to allow recess appointments, which is basically a way of saying, I don't want all my nominees to be confirmed by the Senate. I want another way in.
Yeah, and I think it's safe to say if we got to that point, it would set the tone for the rest of the Trump administration. That's it for today's episode. Thank you so much, Michael.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Michael Shearer is a national political reporter for The Post, and I'm Aaron Blake, senior political reporter. If you want more original, deep analysis of campaign news, make sure you're subscribing to my newsletter, also called The Campaign Moment. You can find a link in our show notes and at postreports.com. And if you don't already, make sure to subscribe to the Campaign Moment podcast feed for more great episodes like this one. You can find us wherever you listen, and if you're enjoying the show, make sure you tell a friend who you think would like it and give us a rating and review. Today's episode was produced by Laura Benshoff and mixed by Rennie Svirnovskiy. It was edited by Reena, Flores, and Mary Jo Murphy. We'll be back in your feed this Friday with our regularly scheduled episode. See you then.